So I'm here to talk about designing for performance. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that all of the slides and the resources are actually linked to from laraswanson.com/design. I'll also be auto-tweeting some of the resources on Twitter, so you can follow me at Lara Swanson. We're going to cover some image, some font, some markup optimizations that you can make to optimize for front-end page load time. Before we really get into it, I want to talk about where I work. I work at Etsy. We are a place where creative people from around the globe can connect to buy and sell unique goods. We've seen tremendous growth. We've got about 180 engineers on the team. We see about 60 million monthly visitors and about 1.5 billion monthly page views to the site. So who am I? I'm Lara Swanson, and I lead a team of mobile web developers whose job it is to make sure that all the product teams that are working on new features at Etsy have the support they need to make sure that they're thinking about things mobile first or incorporating mobile web into their product or feature plans. We partner very closely with the performance team, who basically has the same job as the mobile web team, but they focus on performance. So take a minute and think to yourself, I'm waiting for the bus, or I'm waiting to cross the street. What do you do in this time? You probably take out your phone, maybe you tweet something, email something, check your email. This is the amount of time that your users have to accomplish the one thing that they want to do on your site. Web performance absolutely is user experience. It's being factored into search engine results, and its effect on user behavior are being studied by major sites. If you're looking for a benchmark, this is it. Users are expecting your pages to load in 2 seconds, and after 3 seconds, up to 40% of your visitors will abandon your site. Think about how you search for things on the web. How quickly do you close a tab and move on to the next thing if a site is taking too long to load? This is evidenced by a recent study that we at Etsy ran. We added 160 kilobytes of images, hidden images, to a page, and we saw that it increased the bounce rate for mobile visitors by 12%. DoubleClick ran a similar study. They removed one client-side redirect and saw a 12% click-through rate from mobile visitors. So again, envision that bus. That's the time that a user has to complete a task on your site. Ask yourself, is my site fast enough to allow that visitor to accomplish that one thing that they want to do? Historically, we have not designed for performance. We have increasingly rich content, lots of dynamic images, larger JavaScript files, beautiful animations, etc. We may optimize design and layout for mobile, but we almost always don't optimize for page speed on mobile. Some responsively designed sites are irresponsible with the amount of page weight and requests it needs to load the page on mobile. But the thing is, as we all know, fast page load time builds trust in your site. You'll see more returning visitors. We'll see more people choosing you over a competitor. We'll see more people trusting your brand. User experience affects all of these things, and web performance absolutely is a part of user experience. When it comes to design, sometimes we'll make choices that favor performance, and other times we'll make choices that favor aesthetics. The key is to always measure the effects of what it is that you're working on. So take a minute and think about your most recent design. I'm going to do this with the Etsy homepage. Here's some good questions that we should be asking ourselves at Etsy as we're rolling out a new homepage. What value does this large hero image have? Will 3 different font weights help drive conversions? Or my personal favorite, what metric are we actually hoping will improve with a rotating image carousel? Aesthetics absolutely contribute to overall conversion rate, just like performance does. So we should be thinking about this stuff from the design stage and benchmarking it as we go. So as we walk through these optimizations, what are the things that we're really trying to optimize for? Paul Irish did a great job this morning of walking us through web page test. We will be optimizing for a number of requests. We at Etsy actually have a personal instance installed of web page test, which you can use. You can also use the public one. You'll be looking at the number of requests that it takes to load your page. You'll also be looking at the size of these requests. So this is just an example. On Etsy.com, we're loading between 8K and, say, 74K in this instance, different kinds of assets. So as we walk through all these optimizations, we're definitely going to be thinking about these things. Here are some of the biggest wins for requests that we are going to walk through. Image formatting, size, and spriting. Cutting down on font weights. We're going to talk about how important it is to use semantic markup and to be thinking about things with repurposability in mind. And we're also going to talk about deliberate asset loading, especially for mobile visitors. So the first one is like the easiest win, because images make up the vast majority of content on the web. This is a graph from httparchive.org showing the average bytes per page by content type, and you can see that images totally went out. To make sure we have a baseline, let's walk through our formats. PNGs are great for when you have transparency or when you have very few colors. JPEGs are good for images like photos, which have tons of colors, and they do not support transparency. And GIFs, or GIFs. I'm going to call them GIFs. They're very heavy, and most animations these days can be replaced with CSS3. So I recommend avoiding GIFs altogether, unless you're Imager, which Paul Irish obviously demonstrated this morning could be improved. So when it comes to choosing your PNG, PNG 8s contain a maximum of 256 colors. This doesn't mean you only have 256 in the spectrum to choose from. It means it'll just cut you off at 256 in your exported image. It uses alpha transparency. You can see that in Photoshop, there's a matte around the transparency of the image. Not all image editors export things this way, but this is certainly true for Photoshop. And because of these things, PNG 8s generally have a smaller file size. PNG 24s have much prettier transparency, as you can see. They also generally have a larger file size due to the larger number of colors that they can handle. When it comes to JPEGs and say for web, you should be testing different qualities and finding the medium of aesthetics and performance. Most people find that for JPEGs, between 80 and 90% quality is sufficient, but I really emphasize you should be playing with these things, looking for artifacting, and see where you can make that concession of overall compression and file size. Lastly, never, ever, ever upload anything to the web unless you've been running it through some sort of compression tool after Photoshop. I recommend either Smush It or ImageOptim. ImageOptim you can actually download to your Mac, and Smush It is online. Both basically find the best compression technique for whatever image format it is that you've uploaded to them. I think with ImageOptim, I usually find about like a 30% savings on PNGs. So it's absolutely worth trying one of these lossless compression tools for all of your images. So that was all about file size of images. Now, when it comes to requests, sprites are a great option. Sprites are great because you basically have one request for lots of different images. That one asset can get cached and repurposed, and it's a huge win. This is an example from a site that I worked at a number of years ago. We had 26 thumbnails that rotated in and out of 10 slots. We originally had 26 different images that we rotated in and out. What we did was we sprited these images into one image, and we added additional CSS and JavaScript to rotate this image in and out. This actually added about 60% page weight to the page, but it cut page load time by 35%. So if you're ever wondering, I wonder, will this really help? This is extra page weight, but I'm not sure if this will have a huge impact. Test it. There's no reason to not try. Even if it seems risky, the performance win might be worth it. So you should absolutely be testing and experimenting on these things. So good questions to ask yourself when it comes to images. How compressed can this image be? How many colors do I need? Do I need transparency? And can I sprite it? The one last thing I want to mention about optimizing images is it affects not just page load time, but also battery consumption on mobile devices. A recent study showed that if Amazon took all of the images that were on their site and changed them to be compressed JPEGs, and not that even that heavily compressed, it would save 20% of the energy needed to load a web page on mobile devices. And on Facebook, it would save 30%. We're talking about the joules of energy needed to load these pages. So you're affecting the entire user experience, not just page load time. Pop quiz. What file type would you use for the backgrounds on these buttons? PNG 8, PNG 24, GIF, JPEG? Somebody shout it out. I'm sorry, guys. It's a trap. It's CSS3. So CSS3 gradients are amazing, and I love them, and I could talk about how much I love them all day. CSS3 gradients can handle transparency. They could be overlaid on a background color. So if you go from transparent to white, you could overlay that gradient on any color button and create a beveled button, which is repurposed in your CSS. You don't have to write all these lines of code. CSS3 gradients also eliminate an image request, and they're super easy to re-edit, which means that it saves you a ton of development time later if you ever want to change it. I'm sure you've all spent many hours trying to re-edit old images that were exported by somebody else years ago. You can see that there's a lot of markup for CSS3 gradients. However, I would say don't worry about this in terms of page load time. gzip actually handles the compression of this really well. You should all be using gzip. But also in the future, I'm sure we're going to find some standard and be able to limit all of this markup in the future. Now, CSS3 gradients can be powerful. All of the things on here were developed using just CSS3. You can go to CSS3 Geometry Daily, which is a Tumblr that I run. You can see all these amazing things, but it can create jank or sluggishness in your UI. So as powerful as it is, I would recommend being cautious with the amount of CSS3 that you include on your site, as it can be a performance issue. You can check out jankfree.org if you start to see UI sluggishness, as it may be some sort of repaint time with your CSS3 or JavaScript. So good questions to ask yourself as you're considering gradients. Can any of my images be replaced with a gradient? Will this gradient work over multiple background colors, i.e., can I repurpose this? And is there any UI sluggishness that could be due to repaint times? Fonts. Here's the thing about fonts. IE8 and lower downloads all of the fonts that are included in your CSS file, whether or not you use them on the page. And IE9 and higher, with compatibility mode turned on, also download all of the fonts, which is why I recommend you only import the font weights that you actually need on the page. Consider combining or consolidating the font weights, or just not using them entirely. This has everything to do with optimizing the size and number of requests. The more font weights you use, the longer the page will take to load, because font files can be very heavy. The average font served up by Google Web Fonts is about 35K, but can be upwards of 200K depending upon language support. So you can make optimizations to them using tools like Font Squirrel's Font Face Generator, which basically allows you to pick and choose which characters you want to include, also known as character subsetting. One more advanced option is to AJAX in a separate style sheet that declares the font. There are pros and cons to this method, so test it and see what works for your site. Good questions to ask yourself include, what font weights do I really need in this design? Can any weights be combined or consolidated? And can I remove some of the characters to decrease the file size? One thing I want to mention is that we at Etsy actually have declared a ban on font files if it's loading on a mobile device, just because these can so significantly impact the performance of a page. Semantics and repurposability. So we're going to talk about HTML and CSS here. You will save development and page load time by thinking about the semantics and the repurposability of everything that you design. This is an example from a site cleanup that I did a couple companies ago. This was not at all a redesign. This was purely a cleanup. I went through to figure out how many unnecessary elements there was, aka divitis. I went through to see what I could repurpose, what design patterns could be created and reused, what assets I could cache, what images could be sprited, and you can see the results. We had significantly less file size in our HTML, CSS, and style sheet images by just doing a pure cleanup. This is like one of the most fun things in the world. We actually cut page load time in half by just doing a cleanup of the markup. So as you're designing and developing, ask yourself, can someone else at my organization or elsewhere in the world reuse this pattern? Assets that get repurposed can get cached, which is a huge performance win. So the first step in this process is renaming non-semantic elements to something that's more semantic. Naming patterns, as we all know, is something that's hotly debated in our industry. I actually recommend that for a small or medium site, you name things semantically. A site as big as Facebook should absolutely use an object-oriented CSS naming pattern because of the number of developers, because of the size of the code base, etc. But from a pure semantics and repurposability standpoint, this ends up being cleaner for most sites. Next step is go through and remove your inefficient selectors. It used to be a widely held belief, and was true, that inefficient selectors were bad for performance. Thankfully now, with more modern browsers, this is no longer a performance issue. So why do I care about this? Inefficient selectors tend to mean that something is very, very wrong in your code base. Usually if you have a long string of selectors, in this case, a class of wide, ID of sidebar, and a link with class search, means that you're trying to override something else in your CSS in a bad way, in a way that probably is very inefficient for your markup and repurposability. So go through and look for inefficient selectors because they can be a huge gold mine in your cleanup efforts into making things more repurposable. And lastly, Divitis. Go through and remove all those unnecessary elements. If you're curious as to how many elements you actually have on your page, go into Firefox's 3D view, which is built right into Firefox, and you can see the nesting depth of all your elements. You can see the before and after of a redesign that I did, and you can see how fewer elements there were in the after. We were very intentional about Divitis. So this may be a good tool you can use to convince people that you would actually need to impact your site with a cleanup. So questions to ask yourself. Did I create a design pattern that can be repurposed? Did I use semantic element names and a solid HTML hierarchy? And can my work be repurposed by somebody else? Now, we just walked through a lot of things that actually apply to sites that are responsively designed, but there are some responsive web design specific solutions that I also recommend considering. Why do we talk about performance so much when we talk about responsive web design? So for a ton of internet users globally, mobile is the primary internet access method. This is also especially true in lower socioeconomic locations in the United States. So overall, in the United States, we're only seeing maybe 25% of people using mobile only to access the internet. But globally, this is not the case whatsoever. And the thing is that mobile performance is terrible. Before a device can transmit or receive data, it has to establish a radio channel with the network. This can take several seconds. The best part is, if there's no data transmitted or received, after a timeout, the channel will go idle, which requires a new channel to be established. And this can obviously wreak havoc on your page load times. On a typical US desktop using Wi-Fi, a request average round trip takes less than 50 milliseconds. On a mobile network, it's more than 300. This is equivalent to old dial-up connections. But responsive web design doesn't have to be bad for performance. There's plenty of things that we can do to make an impact. If you start your development or design workflow by thinking of your project from a mobile-first perspective, you may be able to avoid many of the issues that bloated desktop sites face. Designing mobile-first can save you time by forcing big questions early, like what the core purpose of your page or site is, and trimming all the other cruft. As you implement responsive web design, you'll make choices about your content size as it's displayed to the user. It may be fluid, and it may be fixed and changed at certain breakpoints, and you may choose to simply not load certain assets at certain screen sizes. This is why it's important to make sure you are only loading the assets that your user really needs. One approach to consider is conditional loading. You may have heard of the term REST, which is using responsive web design with server-side. This takes into account what device the user is using, whether they have touch capabilities, what their screen size is, etc. And it'll help you only load the content that's necessary for the user to see. So for example, adaptive images detects your visitor's screen size and automatically creates, caches, and delivers device-appropriate, rescaled versions of your web page's embedded HTML images. Lazy loading is absolutely another option. However, this can cause problems for screen readers, search bots, and users with JavaScript disabled. Third-party scripts, we all have them. They can be a single point of failure for your site, but equally importantly, if they do load on your site, they can drag down its performance. This happened to us when I was working at Dyn, when Google Plus transitioned from the old button to the new button, they actually loaded both versions of the image, which actually slowed down our page load time. And from left to right here, you can see Twitter, Facebook Like, Google+, and the old Facebook Share buttons. There is no reason why these things should be loading synchronously. You should always be loading them asynchronously. And if your third-party provider does not give you an asynchronous version, you should demand it. You should also consider replacing these in your responsive web design with simple links with images that you have so much more control over the performance of. Picture fill is another technique you can use to deliver the correctly sized image to your user. It mimics the proposed picture element, requires a tiny JavaScript file, and works across all browsers. So the markup looks like this. You set data source and data media attributes for each image size. Performance-wise, this is excellent. It provides unique image URLs, which can be cached, and it starts with the smallest image and requires only one image download for the user. And there's even a fallback for old IE browsers. However, as you can see, this markup ends up being pretty sizable, and it may be harder to replace in the future if browsers decide on a different universal responsive image solution. But again, everything that we've talked about so far can actually apply to a responsively designed site. A lot of you may be wondering, I care deeply about performance, but other people at my company don't. Maybe it's designers, maybe it's engineers, maybe it's management. So who's responsible for implementing these techniques? I strongly believe that there should be no performance cops or performance janitors. Being a performance cop or a performance janitor at your organization is not sustainable. It is truly everyone's responsibility. Otherwise, you'll be endlessly fighting an uphill battle. You need a culture of performance. But changing culture is hard. In fact, I'd assert that maybe this is the hardest part about performance. We at Etsy even struggle with it. And we've had top-down management buy-in and a metrics-focused development cycle for years. So I'm going to tell you what Etsy did to kickstart the culture of performance. A number of years ago, a guy named Seth Walker, that's him with the sunglasses, he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to publish some metrics on our company blog. This was obviously terrifying. But what he did was he made us accountable to our community, and he put us on the hook for performance. He chose some basic performance metrics, and he published them on the company blog, even though the metrics were actually really embarrassing. It forced us to iterate and improve on our most important pages. And because we committed to a monthly weather report, it forced us to nail down repeatable and measurable metrics as a baseline. We wanted to compare apples to apples, and that helped us prepare for the next month's work. A few folks at some monitoring companies, who I will not name, reached out to us to say, that data, yeah, that's exactly what we've been measuring for you, so well done on that. Which means that not just we are focused on our performance metrics, other people are also looking at performance metrics. So remember that this stuff isn't secret. What you guys have as your page load time is visible by anybody, especially your competitors. So remember that performance is at least important, if not more important, to your competitors as it is to you. Thanks to this first weather report, we actually killed parts of our originally personalized homepage to improve page load times, and actually it improved our search engine code with this new weather report. We immediately started seeing buy-in from development teams across the company, and it's continued to be a focus for us. The side effect of all this uncovering the performance bugs that we wouldn't have otherwise seen, and we actively celebrate these kinds of wins internally. I actually want to point out that this fellow here is sitting right here in the front row, so I want to give him a round of applause. Just this morning, we actually celebrated this win on the performance team. He cleaned up a ton of our code. So it's very important to us to continue to celebrate these kinds of things eternally. The guy who originally did these weather reports, Seth Walker, has a huge presentation on how we changed the culture at Etsy. I've just tweeted it, thanks Keynote. So feel free to check out my Twitter or go to laraswanson.com/design to find the link to it. So again, as you design, ask yourself, how many asset requests am I creating? Can I find a way to slim down the number of assets I'm loading? Are my images really large or not sprited? Can any be replaced with CSS3? And how can I be smart about weighing aesthetics and performance, especially when it comes to heavy assets like fonts? What can I repurpose so that it's cache for the user or helps with devitis or the size of my markup? One additional recommendation I have when approaching a new project is to create a performance budget, such as a total page weight limit or total page load time goal. By creating a budget up front, you can have an easy baseline to refer to as you design and develop. So if you say you want your page to load under 2 seconds, you can start to make those exchanges of aesthetics and performance to basically meet that goal. Yes, I want to make the aesthetics a little bit better by decreasing performance, but we're still hitting this 2-second page load time. It allows you to be flexible as you iterate. I also recommend that you get your designs into the browser as quickly as possible. Photoshop is an unrealistic method of gauging how effective the design will be once it exists in its final environment, and you can start to see how large your page weight is and how your design affects performance. Lastly, continue to iterate on existing designs with performance in mind. If you want to make some aesthetic decisions that negatively impact performance, A/B test them to see which one actually improves engagement metrics. Continue to benchmark and iterate on performance as well as engagement metrics as you make any changes to your design. As Brad Frost says, good performance is good design. There's a ton of other improvements you can make on the back end, but 80 to 90% of end user response time is on the front end. And on mobile, it can be up to 97%. So optimize for good performance, and you'll have a huge leg up on creating an excellent user experience. And we're hiring. Thank you.